designed to encourage, empower, and educate real estate professionals by sharing best practices from business leaders that are proven winners. I'm your host, Kyle Malnati, and this is Calibrate Real Estate. Broadcasting from the Mile High City, I'm your host of Calibrate. I'm Kyle Malnati. This is a real estate podcast, and I'm so honored to have a repeat guest join us again. Scott Rathbun is a part of a group called Apartment Appraisers and Consultants. Scott joined that company in 2014. The founder of the company is a guy that we've had on our podcast before, Kerry Brutag, and Kerry's become quite a legend in the multifamily world, in statistics. And Kerry joined us on episode 44 of the podcast back in 2018. Scott and Kerry did a group presentation in 2020 during the pandemic, and now 2026, Scott's back, and really we're going to have a conversation about rents. We're going to have a conversation about vacancy, housing, construction, absorption rates. This is going to be a very heady conversation, and that's really the thought that I have is, where are we heading in the marketplace? Brief introduction of Scott, if you didn't listen to those previous episodes. He has been with Apartment Appraisers and Consultants since 2014, but he became the president and owner of Apartment Appraisers and Consultants, or AANC to be short, in June of 2021, and does all sorts of work in the apartment field, from feasibility studies to fee-based appraisals, and is a very highly sought after guest at conferences, guest speaker. And Scott, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to do a screen share. And for those of you that are listening on a platform like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I love it that you're listening there, but you may want to pop over to YouTube, because this screen share is going to be a big conversation about data, and we're going to move quickly through it. So to see all of the slides, you'll want to be on YouTube. Scott, welcome to Calibrate, our real estate podcast, and thanks so much for joining us again.
Well, thank you, Kyle, for having me. I appreciate you having me on here and let me talk about the market. Yeah, it's kind of one of those things where we're going to talk about where we are today and where we're headed. Where we are today isn't necessarily a fun story for everybody, so I will warn everybody. But I also want to just give you a quick introduction as well to the fact that all the data that I'm going to be presenting here is from our sister company called Apartment Insights. Apartment Insights surveys every property throughout the Front Range, Northern Colorado, Denver metro area, and Colorado Springs every quarter, as long as it's 50 units or larger. We don't survey those smaller properties just because really it's not feasible to do so. The larger properties are all professionally managed, and they're just easier to survey. So keep in mind that that's where this data comes from. Keep in mind that there's not 24 door, 16 door unit data in this data set, but at the end of the day, the trends are all still the same. And we've run statistical analysis as to what would happen if we did try and add that smaller property data, and it really only changes the numbers by a couple of dollars. So there's not really a big difference, but just want you to understand what you're seeing and what you're hearing before we move on. But let's go ahead and jump right into it. So, and Kyle, please stop me if you have questions in the middle. Otherwise, everybody, I'm going to go kind of quickly, so we'll be drinking from a fire hose here. But first of all, I'd just like to talk about the two drivers of housing demand right now. And the two drivers generally are population growth. You need more bodies. And what brings more bodies? Employment, right? So historically, our population growth has been very strong. We've had a lot of in-migration. Colorado is a great place to live, obviously a great quality of life. And so we've had a lot of people moving into the state historically. What we're seeing is that is slowing, and that's largely probably just because it's getting to be a more expensive market. And we actually are supposed to have some relatively low in-migration for the next few years, and then the demography office is projecting that it will go back up, but it's not going to go back up anywhere near the levels that we saw during the 2010s and during the 1990s. So population growth is slowing across the country. I'm sure we've all heard that, and Colorado and Denver is not immune to that. By the way, all the numbers that I'm going to be presenting here are for the 7-county Denver metro area being Adams, Arapahoe, Denver, Douglas, Broomfield, Boulder, and Jeffco. So anyway, in addition to which, our employment story nationally, as well as in Colorado, has been relatively anemic. We had the pandemic, we recovered from the pandemic. There was relatively healthy employment growth for a few years after that. But as you can see here in the graph that I'm showing, the employment growth in the Denver metro area has really fallen down to basically nothing. And so there's very little growth happening on the employment side. Well, during this, these two important drivers of housing demand falling and really not having a great story, Denver has set absorption records. So, how are we absorbing and how is our demand so high for apartments right now if really the two drivers of housing, that story isn't great? Because if you look at the graph I'm showing right now, you'll see that but for post-pandemic when we had kind of a reopening of the world, right? And we had exploding houses exploding from two parents and then two kids in the basement who then moved out and got their own apartments. And that created unnatural demand as a result of that. But that was a one-time event. We've set our second highest ever yearly absorption rate at almost 14,300 units in 2025. And so, how are we absorbing? How do we have so much demand for apartments if these other major drivers aren't great? Well, Colorado is a very expensive place to live, as we all know. What you'll see here, and this is from MLS data, and basically it's just showing that all of the major housing markets along the Front Range, Colorado Springs, Greeley, Denver, Fort Collins, Boulder, they're all in the top quartile. So they're in the top 25% of the most expensive places to live in the country, very much above the median average, and even above that 75% level. And so it's very expensive to live here. So what has happened is we've had people who can afford to buy a home, they can afford to pay a mortgage, but they can't afford the down on a home that's $670,000, a median value home, let alone a newer home that costs more than that, right? And so if you've got a healthy income to pay a nice mortgage, but you can't save $150,000 for your down, that kind of forces you into the rental market. And so we're seeing that exactly happening nationwide. The median age of first-time home buyers used to be 29, 30 years old. And that was true from the 1980s all the way through the early 2020s. But then over the last 3 or 4 years, that shot up from 30 to 40. And so we have a decade of people who historically used to move out at 30, you'd buy a house, you'd vacate apartment units, and at that point, those units would be available for the next decade to move into, that next generation. Well, now we're staying for an extra decade. So that younger generation that's now turning 20 and aging into needing their own housing, there's no housing for them. And so we're having to build new units for those people to move into, right? Because we have this demand coming up, but we're not vacating the units that we previously vacated. So that's what's happening. That's creating an unnatural, basically, demand for apartments without population growth and without employment growth. If you look here, does that mean everybody's 40 before they buy a house? No, of course not. It looks like 32% of people still buy a house between 25 and 34. But if you look at the numbers below that, there are significant numbers of people from, almost 10% that wait until their late 60s, up to 25% that are 35 to 44 before they buy a home. And all of those are material numbers, right? And so as people age and wait longer, it's creating a shift in the percentage of homeowners in our market. The ratio of first-time home buyers has historically been between 40 and 50%, and that's fallen down to 20% now. So only 20% of home sales are to first-time home buyers. So what that's doing, it's basically creating unnatural demand without any population growth, without any employment growth, because our home ownership rate is falling. If you think about it, we have about 1.4 million households in the Denver metro area. And so a 1% change in that home ownership rate would create demand. 1% of 1.4 million is 14,000. So you can create demand for 14,000 apartments by simply shifting that homeownership rate by 1%. If it goes down by 1%, if it goes down by 2%, that's demand for almost 30,000 apartments. And as you can see in the graph I'm showing here, the homeownership rate in Denver especially has fallen from about 66% down to well below 60% over the last few years. And so we've just created this demand from a not historically normal source. And so right now, even with this huge demand, we have managed to overbuild the market. So I want to talk really quickly about rents and vacancy and what's happening there. Because we overbuilt the market, our vacancy has recently increased. Okay, so our vacancy shot up, and right now I'm showing two different vacancies. We have stabilized vacancy for stabilized properties at about 7.6%, and we have all property vacancy at about 11.2%. And the difference is all property vacancy includes properties in lease up. And there are a lot of people who think that that's the only vacancy that matters and that's the only vacancy that counts. We actually present the stabilized vacancy number because when you run a correlation analysis with stabilized vacancy and rent growth, stabilized vacancy is more highly correlated to rent growth than the all property vacancy. Now, in fairness, if you put those together and you run that same correlation analysis, the correlation goes up significantly. So you really need to look at both the all property vacancy and the stabilized vacancy together to really understand and have a good idea of maybe what's going to happen with rent growth, what happened historically, and what might happen moving forward. But that's why we present both of those numbers. It's a very rare occasion when you are an owner of an apartment community that the lease up properties really impact your operations. And that's why stabilized vacancy is an important measure. But right now, we are in one of those situations where that lease up market really is impacting those markets.
Scott, I've heard people in economic terms talk about vacancy rates and certain benchmarks of when building begins, when you slide into a market where you've got too much supply and not enough demand. Would you just summarize that for me real quick on just kind of when you start to see demand for new units because vacancy's gone to a low level and that means we should start building again. And then also, when you start to see vacancy creep up and maybe that means a bigger issue in the marketplace.
Yeah, I mean, historically, so there's not really a magic bullet or a magic number for that. There's not like a set number for vacancy that says at 7% vacancy this happens and at 5% vacancy this happens. Historically, really, that number had been 8%. We didn't really see negative rent growth until we hit 8%, a stabilized vacancy. But we've seen negative rent growth here now in our market for 7 quarters in a row. And we haven't hit 8% vacancy yet. So really, we started seeing negative rent growth when vacancy was in the high sixes, mid to high sixes. And now we're, quarter over quarter, we're up 132 basis points. So previously we were at about 7.2 and now we're at 7.3 and we're now at about 7.6. What I would say is that, yes, in general, as vacancy goes up, that creates a slowing in the deliveries, right? And then as vacancy comes back down, that will create more interest in delivering more units. What I think really matters more than the vacancy is what's happening with rent growth, right? So as long as rent growth is strong, you're going to see people wanting to build and able to build, making it feasible to build apartments. So they go hand in hand, and I would say that right now, I don't know what that number is for the vacancy. What I'm looking for is when we see rent growth turn back over to seeing positive rent growth. And we'll talk about that in a minute as to when I think that'll happen. But does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And what I find interesting in this particular graph is I'm looking at the gap of vacancy rate in sort of it started, call it in the third quarter of 2015, all the way through about 2020 before we headed into the pandemic. We were between 5 and 6% vacant at that time on stabilized property. And where you saw the all properties vacancy rate go to 11%, was in the middle of 2017, and we're kind of back at that number again. But the big difference that I see is we're now on stabilized properties at 7.6%. So the gap was actually much bigger about 9 or 10 years ago. And we're starting to kind of see that shift again. Is there any correlation that you've found between this all properties, which you've got build up and lease up properties, compared to stabilized, and how the graph kind of peaks and valleys, but like the two numbers kind of trend with each other, but then spread apart at times?
Right. Well, and so the peaks and valleys there, what you're seeing is seasonality, right? We have a seasonal market here. So we have slightly higher vacancy in the colder months, and we have slightly lower vacancy in the winter months. All those snowbirds leave us for December and go to Arizona, right? And so vacancy pops up for a couple months in the winter and then comes back down in the summer. Um, as far as, yeah, that correlation, yeah, you can, if you look at the graph, you can see historically, prior to 2012, they tracked each other very closely, and that's because the market was smaller, and so there were fewer units in the inventory, and so everything kind of tracked together as that right at 2012 when those numbers start to diverge. That's when Denver grew up and it became a new city. That's when we really saw historical development of apartments in Denver like we hadn't seen since the 1970s. And so that's when we started to see our pipeline grow. And in 2017, that was our previous peak. So at 2017, our our all property vacancy hit its highest point. And if you watch what happens after that, you can actually see that the vacancy started to trend upward a little bit after that, which makes sense because we were delivering a lot of units at the peak of 2017, but we didn't like double our normal deliveries, which is what we did in 2024, by the way. That's why we are where we are. But in 17, we delivered a lot of units, but we didn't double our historical numbers. And so we were still absorbing all those units. And then the pandemic hit, and then post-pandemic, we had this spike in absorption that kind of caused vacancy to come back down. And that's what happened. And you can also see that overall vacancy came down as during COVID as well, because people stopped building for a year, right? Like everything kind of shut down for a year. And so part of this, I think, is that there's like almost 2 years worth of development that ended up moving forward once, because nothing really happened in 2020. So in 2021, things really started to pick up. And in 2021 is when we actually pulled a huge number of permits. So let's talk about this really fast. I was just going to move forward really quickly and talk about the fact that vacancy, elevated vacancy is happening at all classes of properties. The graph I'm showing right now is showing all the different vintages by decade, and it's showing that actually the highest vacancy right now in stabilized properties is in 1970s property, the oldest vintage, and then followed by 2020s, followed by the 80s, and then kind of following from there. But you'll see that they all trend together and that they're all trending upward right now. So how did this happen? Well, in 2020, everything kind of shut down. So in 2022, we pulled basically double the number of units that we had for the past 2 years. So we've historically been pulling about 10 to 14,000 apartment permits for the last 5 or 6 years. And then in 2021, we pulled over 21,000 apartment permits. And if we have a 30-month, 3-year window, that's the construction period is 30 months on average. Well, that means that in theory, we should have an oversized delivery coming in 2024 if we pulled permits in 2021, 3 years later. Now, I was told by the development community that we didn't have the labor, that we just couldn't deliver this many units because we didn't have the bodies to do it. And so it was going to kind of have to trickle out over time, and that construction periods were just going to get longer and longer and longer, and until we got through the pipeline, because we just didn't have the bodies to deliver this number of units. Well, in 2022, we pulled another 19,000, almost 19,100 apartment permits. And if you look at this graph, what you will see is that we hadn't pulled those levels of permits since the 70s. So we're literally almost doubling the number of permits that we pulled for a couple of years post-pandemic. And then during 23 and 24 and 25, that kind of falls back to more normal levels between 10 and call it 12,000 units. But what that means is that in theory, moving forward, there should be a spike in deliveries unless we just truly can't deliver those units. Well, what you will see here, this is a graph of starts. We basically call it a start. As soon as you pull a permit, you don't pull a permit till you're ready to break ground. So really, starts and permits are the same thing. So starts versus completions. And you'll see that 3 years after that 2021 blue line of 21,000 apartment permits pulled, we delivered 23,000 apartments. Historically, we couldn't deliver more than 10 to 13,000 apartments. So we literally almost doubled the number of units. Still don't know how. Nobody can tell me where the labor came from, how we delivered 23,000 units in 2024, but we did. And so moving forward, you'll see that those start to fall off. You'll see that in 2025, we delivered 14,000 units. That would have been, but for the prior year, that would have been a historical high. But even then, we delivered 14. The year before that, we delivered 23. So if I look at the next slide, what you'll see here is that in 2024, we delivered 23,000 units. We only absorbed 11,000 of those units. So that means we left 12,000 units that were in lease up completely empty that year. The next year in 2025, we completed 14,000 units. We absorbed 14,000 units. That doesn't mean that we absorbed the brand new 2025 stuff. That means we absorbed the 2024 stuff. But that left 12 of the 14,000 units that were delivered in 2025 still vacant. Right? And that's just in lease-up properties, not including the vacant properties in the stabilized population. At the end of 2025, the Denver metro area had more than 30,000 total vacant units when you include properties in lease-up. That's a lot of empty boxes, right? So we're going to have to fill those up, and it's going to take a few years to do that, even with high demand. But if you look at moving forward based on our forecasts, you'll see that we start to absorb more than we complete moving forward. And if we absorb more than we complete, then vacancy starts to come down, right? Because now you're filling up more units than you're delivering. So you're eating into that vacancy and that vacancy is falling. So just falling back to all of that caused this spike in vacancy. Moving on, so now we have a vacancy problem. So what are we going to do? We're going to try and buy occupancy. And we buy occupancy with concessions. And what you'll see here, and technically we have the highest concession by dollar amount in the history of our survey. I don't like to measure concessions by dollar amount because the same percentage concession goes up in dollar amount as rents increase, right? So it's not really a great measure, but the percentage is. And right now we're at a 9.5% concession on average for the whole Denver metro area, which is the highest it's been in 19 years. And what that really means when rubber hits the road, 8.3% is 1 month free. We're at 9.5%. So we're somewhere between averaging 4 and 5 weeks free for every property in the entire Denver metro area. Now, does that mean that every property is offering 4 and 5 weeks free? No. Some are not offering any concessions. Some are offering 2 weeks. Some are offering 10 to 12 weeks. And especially those new properties that are all competing and they have 12,000 units they're trying to lease up, they're offering 12 weeks free. Okay? So that's 3 months free. Now, they're not offering 3 months free on a 12-month lease. They're usually offering 3 months free on a 15-month lease. But that's still a significant concession, right? 3 months on a 12-month lease would be a 25% concession. And so we see these concessions moving up, but what that's doing is it's putting downward pressure on the rents at the most expensive level, making those affordable. So people are moving up. It's a ladder effect, right? So if you move up, as people move up, it puts pressure on the level below it. And that creates vacancy there. And then they offer concessions, and then that pulls the people up from the rung below it, and so on and so forth until everybody's moved up a rung. Now the question is, can everybody stay where they're at, or as the market normalizes, does everybody have to climb back down that ladder at some point? That remains to be seen. But moving forward, again, you'll see that the concessions, it's really impacting every vintage of property. Every vintage of property is elevated. Obviously, with the 2020s properties offering the highest concessions on average because they're the ones in lease up.
It's
And
one of the things that I have heard over the years about concessions, because a lot of people will say, well, why can't someone just be disciplined and say that this is the rent that we need and we'll hold a little bit more vacancy instead of trying to buy tenants or get tenants moved in? And one of the answers that I've received is that when you develop new product, you're on a construction loan, which is on a shorter term, could
and
be
a
a
higher interest rate.
higher interest rate, more expensive capital, and the desire is to refinance once you hit a certain vacancy rate. The magic number in the past used to be around 90%
Right.
occupancy, 10% vacancy was where you could start that process of refinancing your construction loan into a more permanent loan. And so I think that's sort of the motivation behind developers, besides just you want to have a full building, you want to be able to stabilize it. But that's sort of the answer that might be people might be thinking about as it relates to why do concessions in the first place instead of just dropping rent.
And it's twofold, right? First, you're really motivated to convert to perm. And second of all, the longer your lease up takes, the more you're going to have to continue to offer concessions. So, this is why generally we don't recommend people deliver more than about 200 units at a time. If they're going to do 400 units, phase it and do two phases of 200 because you can only absorb so fast. And, unless you start offering crazy concessions. But if you absorb, let's say you absorb 20 units a month, which is a pretty hefty absorption number. So you've got 200 units. You want to hit 95% vacancy. You got to get to 190 units. Divide by 20. You can lease that property up in 9.5 months. Um, if you have double that, then that means you're not going to lease that property up and for 19 months, right? You do not want to have to you don't want to cannibalize your own demand. And so you want to lease up before your first 12-month leases turn because you don't want to have to go into a second year offering those first year people another concession. And so between the motivation to fill up fast because of the conversion to perm, you also want to fill up because you don't want to have to keep offering concessions basically in perpetuity, right? Like you need to hit that stabilized number so you can stop offering those lease up concessions. Um, so what has that really done? Well, before we step forward, I just want to talk about this, and that is simply this is a reminder that everything that we're talking about here are averages, and that's a single number, and no market is actually a single number. So this is a graph showing that vacancy is different and average vacancy is different by county, right? You're going to have vacancy over 8% in Arapahoe County and in Denver County, but you're going to have vacancy at or below 7% in Adams, Boulder, Broomfield, Douglas County, and Jeffco. And that averages out to the 7.6% vacancy. So just keep in mind, as we all have heard since we were kids, real estate, location, 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 right? Locational, and your answer is going to be different than the average. But we're talking about trends here. And the trends, as you see, do follow. They all follow the same trends, they just stack up a little bit differently.
And
So
on that,
moving forward,
Scott,
what is this? Oh, go ahead.
is there any discernible change that you're seeing in where the population is shifting? If we go back to that slide for a second, um, that's a question that comes up in a lot of the different real estate groups that I'm a part of. Is are young people, your apartment renters, kind of 18 to 40, if we use that median age from the National Association of Realtors, so that 22-year period of life that people are in where they're renters. Did it used to be focused on the city and county of Denver, and now it's moving somewhere else? Are you seeing any sort of discernible trend that populations are kind of moving around the metro area?
I mean, I think because of the fact that So the answer to that is twofold. One, there's still a lot of people moving into the denser locations like the downtown areas because that's where all the development is. That where you can develop more units is the denser locations, and that's right now where they're offering those huge concessions, right? So we're still driving demand in those locations by buying occupancy with big concessions. That said, when people used to, stop renting at age 30, they were usually in need of a one bedroom or a two bedroom. Maybe they had just gotten married or maybe just had a baby. But really you weren't into family life at that point. Now, when you're renting until you're 40, we're starting to see demand for larger two bedroom units and three bedroom units, and even demand for single family type rentals. And that's why you're seeing an increase in what they call build to rent. So you're seeing rental townhomes and you're seeing, and not just a one-off, but an entire community full of rental townhomes or an entire community full of rental single family homes. Right. And so we're seeing that single family home and where that's happening is the suburbs because that's where the land is available. And so you are seeing a shift to the suburbs generally because you have in those denser locations, you have higher concentrations of studios and ones, and then in the suburbs, you start to see higher concentrations, not big concentrations still, but much higher concentrations of larger two-bedroom units and larger units than that, just in general, right? And so we are seeing a shift to the suburbs as you age as a renter. You're going to continue to be a renter, but instead of moving to the suburbs to buy a home, you might move to the suburbs to rent a home. Again, because you can't afford that down. So moving on, what is this doing to rents? Well, in this graph, I have this dotted line, which is basically a faux regression line showing the direction of where the market was heading prior to COVID, and then it shows that during COVID everything flattened out. We weren't sure what was happening, and you can see that we started offering concessions during COVID to keep heads on beds, and then post COVID. With that explosion of demand, okay, so we had an explosion of demand. Economics 101 says if demand exceeds supply, rents go up. Well, rents went up a lot. You can see that was almost a vertical line for a while there. And then it kind of leveled back off, but it created almost a new normal. And at this point, when that line was so tall, we had a trailing 12-month period where year over year rent growth was 20%. And then the next quarter, the trailing 12 was 15, and the next quarter, the trailing 12 was 10, and the next quarter, the trailing 12 was 5. So it kind of normalized back down to a more normal number. But we had a full year there post-COVID where rents went up a lot very quickly. But what you can see by that faux regression line is that now that we've overbuilt the market in the way that we have, what you will see is that rents have come back down, not just to that line, but below that line. Gross rents are below that line, and effective rents are well below that line. And our effective rents, which are net of concessions, have fallen almost 10% year over year, 9.8% year over year. And if I go to the next slide, it's basically just zoomed into the last few years. And what it shows is if rents fell by 9.8% year over year, our effective rents are at the lowest level they've been in nearly 5 years. So you can go back 4 to 5 years from today, and we're basically at the same rents today as we were 4 to 5 years ago. So, mantra of the story is if we deliver a lot of units, then supply starts to exceed demand. Economics 101 says prices come down. So if you're a renter, that's good. If you're an owner, that's not so good, right? Moving forward, you'll just see that spike here in the effective growth rate up to 20% and then falling all the way down to the current negative 9.8%. We've actually had negative year over year growth for 7 quarters in a row, which is the longest in our survey. Our survey started in 2004. I'm guessing it's probably the longest since the 80s, if not the 70s. The 80s and the 80s in Denver was a rough time. So we may have seen something like that in the 80s, but not in modern times.
Now, what is the effective rental growth rate? What does that mean as people are looking at it?
Just year over year, the net rent or the effective rent, how much has it grown from the prior year?
Got it.
So if last year rents were at $1,000 and this year they're at 1,100, then that trailing 12-month, that would be a 10% rent growth, right? And so what we're seeing is instead of if rents were at $1,000 last year, Rents are at $900 today because we had 10% negative rent growth. So then if you look and we move on, you can see that this is again affecting, because of that ladder effect, all vintages of properties, from brand new properties all the way down to the 70s. And what you will see in that little circle is that the average effective rents for 2020's vintage are only slightly higher than the average rents for the 90s and the 2000s vintage, and that the 2010s vintage is actually more expensive than all of them. But if I zoom in on that little circle, and we get closer, you can see that all of those rents for all 4 decades, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and 2020s, they've compressed into a situation where they're all within $100 of each other. So the average rent, you could be a 90s renter and only pay an extra $26 or $25 a month and move from a 90s property to a brand new Class A 2020, just delivered, with all the current amenities. And who's not going to do that for an extra $25, right? And you're getting 3 months free, and it's a 15-month lease, and like that seems like a great deal. So that's what's causing this ladder effect. People are moving from these older vintages to the newer vintage because it's cheaper, and that's putting pressure on those vintages that are, the 90s and 2000s, which then the people who live in the 80s and 70s properties move up into, and that's actually even pushing down into the affordable market, which we'll talk about at the end here. Again, this is just average rents by county. Again, talking about the fact that, this is a single number. That average effective rent was $1,608, so $1,600 a month. Well, that's the average for and that was the effective rent. These are gross rents. This is a chart from the Apartment Association of Metro Denver. We also do their survey, but they only present gross rents, and you'll see that even still, certain counties have higher than average rents and certain counties have lower than average rents. And what you'll see here is that Douglas County is the highest average rent. Boulder Broomfield follows. If you split Boulder and Broomfield up, Boulder might be higher than Douglas County. They go together because the AANC survey went back long before Broomfield became a county in 2004. And so rather than, they wanted to keep that consistent, and so they left those two together. But above average markets are generally Douglas, Boulder Broomfield, Denver, and Jeffco. And especially Jeffco seems to kind of hug that average pretty well. And then below average markets tend to be Arapahoe County and Adams County. But what you will see again in this graph is, yeah, they're all stacked, but they all generally follow the same pattern as well. So again, location, location, location. So let's talk about the pipeline and where things are headed from here. Not to belabor this, we had a under construction pipeline a few quarters ago of 45,000 units. That was the peak. That's fallen down to just over 24,000 units. It's down 47%. So what we're delivering moving forward, the number of units that we're delivering moving forward is going to fall. And if we look at our proposed pipeline, we had a peak a couple years ago of 77,000 units total proposed. That's fallen down to 50. And with embedded in that 50, there's another almost 20,000 units that are hung up in the City and County of Denver's inclusionary housing ordinance called the Expanding Housing Affordability, the EHA. And those units have been proposed since before June of 2022. So they've been proposed for almost 4 years, and they haven't been feasible in those 4 years. Long story short, they were required, in order to keep their grandfather status and not have to live up to the subsidized housing requirements in the EHA, they had to be approved, or they had to be applied for by June 30th, and then they had to have an approved site development plan by April of 2025. Once you get your site development plan, you have 18 months to break ground. If you don't break ground in that 18-month window, you lose your SDP. If you lose your SDP, you lose your grandfather status. And if they weren't feasible with the grandfather status, they're definitely not feasible without the grandfather status, right? So basically, and what you will see here is that run up to that June 30th date, we had huge numbers of apartments applied for. 5,000 in the fourth quarter of 21, 10,000 in the first quarter of 22, 20,000 in the second quarter of 22. and then almost very, very few moving forward because people knew that they couldn't make a deal pencil in Denver if they had to live up to the inclusionary housing ordinance because that ordinance is all stick and no carrot. They're asking you to subsidize your rents, but they're not giving an offsetting financial benefit to make the math work. If they'd offered, say, tax abatement on the units that you're offering at 60% of AMI or 70% of AMI, that might have made the math work or it would have made the math easier. But when you're just asking people, you need to have 10 to 15% of your units at below market, and there's nothing to offset that, then equity seeks return. And equity sees we're not going to get the return on this. We can't, we may not even make money on this property at all. And so it's not feasible. We're not building it. And so what could happen very easily is that over time, that those 19,000 units that are locked up in the EHA, they could lose their grandfather status, in which case they could fall out. And 18 months from April of 2025 is October of 2026. So realistically, what would happen is by October 2026, unless the city and county of Denver starts extending everyone, which they very well could do. There was an article in the Denver Right a couple, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, where the mayor said that his biggest concern is that we stop delivering apartments in Denver. And it talked about the 20,000 units that are locked up in the EHA. But he also says he's not going to get rid of the EHA. They're going to fix it other ways. Well, we'll see. I hope they can, but I don't think they're. But for giving some sort of financial benefit, giving that tax abatement, I don't see how this is going to work. So that's where we are, and what that's causing is a reduction in the overall pipeline. That proposed pipeline could fall from 50 to 30 very quickly, right? And is it right now? Is it 50 or 30? I get a lot of pushback. Do those 20,000 units really count? They've been proposed for 4 years. How long are you going to keep them in that pipeline? Well, people are still filing paperwork. They're still paying money, trying to keep them alive. So they're trying to make them work. We're going to keep them in the proposed pipeline, but it may be 50, it may be 30, or it may be somewhere in between. In the meantime, not all of those move forward in any given year. The developer success rate, which is basically just the ratio of properties that actually start construction from that pipeline, every year has been falling and has fallen down to below 20%. So if you're starting 20% of a 50,000 pipeline or 20% of a 30,000 pipeline, those are two very different numbers. And if you move forward, you also are only delivering part of what's under construction every year, right? You're only delivering about 40% of what's under construction. That's how we get to our 30-month average construction period. But what that means is that heading forward, we could get to a point where we're going to be delivering fewer units because the pipeline's shrinking. And from a supply demand perspective, if demand stays where it is and supply starts to fall off a cliff, which is where we're headed, then we're going to have rent growth turn right back over and go from negative to positive, and then possibly do what it did in 2021 and go very positive very quickly. I'm not suggesting we're going to see 20% rent growth, but we could easily see double-digit rent growth. That's just going to be a few years. So what does this show? Completions moving forward, it shows that we're completing more than we're starting. And if we complete more than we start, our pipeline falls. And moving forward, we're absorbing more than we're completing, so vacancy is falling. And what does that do? Well, it makes our vacancy fall. And so we're expecting that we'll end up at vacancy around 6.9% by the end of 26, 6.2% at the end of 27, and down into the mid fives at 5.4% in 28. So we think rent growth is going to come back mid to late 2027 and start to be relatively hefty in 2028, and in 2029 could go crazy unless we fix this supply issue that we are staring down their barrel of. Moving forward very quickly, just want to point out that this is impacting the affordable housing market. Affordable vacancies used to be in the 2 to 3% range, and they're all the way up at 7.2 compared to our conventional market at 7.6. So there used to be a couple 100 basis point spread, and now there's a 20 basis point spread in vacancy. And you can see that the average affordable rent keeps going up, but market rents are coming down. So the delta between the two is starting to close. And at the end of the day, what really this is impacting is the fact that um, on average, a one bedroom unit in the city and county of Denver is now at a 55% AMI level. And that's competing with a 60% AMI, and especially competing with 70 and 80% of AMI affordable properties when people use income averaging. And that 70% of AMI is a target for workforce housing or middle income housing. And our market rents are at 55%, right? And a two bedroom is at 60%. And that's all unit average. If we look at the average for brand new stuff that was just built since 2020, the average one bedroom rent for a brand new apartment in Denver that was built 2020 or newer has fallen from 91% of AMI in 2021 down to 61% of AMI currently. Again, that's competing with the affordable housing market. And so you're seeing affordable people move up into conventional housing because frankly, the administrative burden is so much less in the conventional world. You only have to apply and be approved once. In the affordable world, you have to income qualify every single year, and it's a lot of paperwork as opposed to the paperwork that you do on the conventional side, which is much easier. And so we're seeing pressure from the conventional world impacting the affordable world, and that's where we're at.
So let's talk about that real quick. Define AMI for people who've never heard that acronym.
Yeah, so if you're not in the affordable housing world, uh, we measure subsidized housing based on area median incomes. And HUD publishes an area median income for every county in the country. And so they set affordable rents will be at a certain percentage of those area median incomes. So obviously 100% of the area median income is the median income. And they'll say, hey, for people who need subsidized housing, you're going to pay the equivalent of 60% of the area median income, or you're going to pay the equivalent of 50%. And really, affordable housing has kind of been in the 30 to 60% range historically, and then 20% and 30%, but especially 20%, that's really what we would call permanent supportive housing, which is basically housing for the homeless. And so you're talking about setting rents at a level where you only make 30% of the area median income, or you only make 60% of the area median income, but market rents historically have been above that. And so we're going to give you a rent at an affordable property with subsidized rents that's at a level that you can afford. And right now, the issue is that market rents have come down and started to compete in that space. And so even at somebody who used to have an affordable subsidized 60% rent, market rents are now competing with that.
Yeah, and for those that aren't familiar with subsidized, those are housing vouchers that people are getting. That are government programs to help pay for their rent, basically.
Yeah, between Section 8 vouchers or, yeah, there are also properties that are just the whole entire property was built with tax credits, with low income housing tax credits. And so the entire property is set to basically house people who don't make more than a certain percentage of the area median income.
Thanks for that explanation.
So absolutely, that's my whole story. Is there anything else that you wanted to ask about or
Oh
talk
yeah.
about?
Yeah, I've got to know the man behind the stats. I can picture young Scott at 7 years old with a spreadsheet, making all sorts of predictions. When did you start to get a knack for statistical data? And then further, what drives you to kind of take huge amounts of information and try to distill it down?
So I've always been a math geek. I always loved math. You know, when I was literally in sixth grade, I was reading Jurassic Park and reading about chaos theory, and I was like, I want to be an applied mathematician when I grow up. Like, I wanted to be a math major. Um, I ended up as an accounting major, so I still ended up, kind of in that finance numbers world. And my mind just has always worked that way. I worked in the forensic accounting space for 10 years before I moved over to kind of the appraisal and consulting side of things on real estate. But I was born to be an appraiser. My wife and I, when we went shopping for our first house, I had an Excel spreadsheet and I was literally adjusting being like, well, this is better at this house, this is 5% better, and this is 2% better, and like my wife, she'd just laugh at me and be like, "You're ridiculous." But that's just how my mind has always worked. And so I kind of think that, like you said, 7-year-old Scott would have thought about all this the same way. And I just happened to fall into an area where I got to come into a data-rich company that allowed me to play with the data and start figuring out what does this all mean. And so, Carrie and I both call ourselves lovingly data nerds. And I'm happy to be one and happy to share that data with people because I think it helps to understand the story of what's happening.
The next question I have is if you could describe to someone, like a neighborhood barbecue, what you do as a self-described data nerd on a daily basis. Like what does a day look like for you as an appraiser and as a statistician?
So it's different every day for us because sometimes I'm working on fee work, so we're working on market studies, feasibility studies, where a developer will come to us and say, hey, we have a site and we need you to analyze this site. Sometimes we're working on fee appraisal work where a bank or somebody has come to us and said, "Hey, we need you to tell us what the estimated market value or the estimated market value of XYZ is." And those are kind of similar, again, digging deep into using all this data and digging deep into Excel models to really value those or analyze, demand for things. And then there's really the data analysis piece of it, where I download all the data from our survey and I start just digging through it. And I have huge Excel spreadsheets that I just add new data every quarter, and update all my graphs and kind of just see where the market is headed. And so the answer is sitting at a desk with my face in an Excel spreadsheet pretty much all day, every day.
Now, Apartment Insights, which you had mentioned is the sister company to Apartment Appraisers and Consultants, that's a really robust database. One so robust that the CoStar Group won't allow your team to be a member of or subscriber of their data. How
We're
does
viewed as a
some
competitor, yeah.
Yeah, and so how does someone subscribe to Apartment Insights? What is the cost structure like if they're interested in some of your fee-based reports? How do they find you?
Yeah, so you can go to our website at apartmentappraisers.com. There's a little bit of information there. But really just the bigger answer is to reach out to me. I'm happy to do a demo of the site and what it is and what it can do. Kind of all the reports. Basically, it's a big database on the internet that takes all this data that I've just showed you and allows you to manipulate it using different reports. We have a whole bunch of pre-built reports that you can run that'll help you pick rent comps for a property or help you identify sales or help you see, we have a 20 quarter report that'll show you how a property has and a group of comparables have performed over a 20 quarter period, just to help you kind of see measure how things are either measure how your property is doing or identify possibly low-hanging fruit for purchase or things like that. And so really, we do a lot of demos for people who are interested in subscribing. We just sit down and kind of drive through the site and show you what it can do. Um, Always happy to do that. You can reach out to me at sr@apartmentappraisers.com. Just my initials, Scott Rathbun, sr@apartmentappraisers.com. Um, and yeah, the structure is we sell everything from individual reports. We sell our new construction report and our trends and summary report as a one-off for a couple $100. Or you can subscribe, and there are different levels that you can subscribe to. But the two main levels are just a basic subscription, or the higher level would be a subscription where you can actually enter your own data into the database and kind of pretend like you're building a property and put your data into the database. No one else sees it, it's just yours. But you can analyze your own properties in the database, like if you're a developer and you're looking to build something new. And so those are slightly different in pricing. And Denver and Colorado Springs have different pricing structures. If you subscribe to Denver, you also get Northern Colorado included in that because it's not a large enough market to sell separately. And I think that our pricing right now is around 3,500 a year for Denver and 2,800 a year for the Springs.
One of the things that I know, having been a neighbor of yours in the same office building two different times, two different locations, is that you have a big team that validates all of this data. You don't just take the statistics that you might find online. A lot of people will comb through their favorite rental website and say, "Oh, this place is renting for that or that." Like you actually have people that will dial and survey different apartment communities and do it on a regular basis. So I think it is important to share that you're not just taking information at face value. Um,
Right. So we've kind of set it up where we have relationships with property managers. We email them once a quarter, they fill out their survey and they send it back to us. And then we have a team of callers for the people who are the stragglers who don't forget or just haven't gotten to it yet. So our callers will call them and say, "Hey, you haven't gotten your survey back to us. Can we just do a phone survey?" And then we'll survey it that way just to make sure that we're getting all of the data that we need every quarter. So we've got a team of callers and a team of people that do that. And then once we get the data in, we have a whole bunch of proofreading checks that we do to make sure that, A, because we have to do the data entry, and then we want to make sure that we didn't add an extra zero onto something. And so, we go through a whole bunch of proofing and just make sure. And if there are properties that pop up and it's like, hey, vacancy went from, and this is a 1990s property, and vacancy went from 2% last quarter to 40% this quarter, we're going to call them and verify that this is right and what happened and why. And that's going to be a note that goes into our database on that property that says, because you can literally look up properties by individual property. We have profile pages for each individual property, and it'll say, hey, this property closed 40% of its units for a renovation. Or, they had a building that burned down, or they had a building that flooded. And so they have X number of down units that they're going to have to deal with over the next quarter or whatever. And so we really do try and get the best data and make sure that the data makes sense. We're not just scraping websites and scraping the internet and taking whatever we find. Like we really cultivate and proofread and make sure that the data that's going into our database is good data because, bad in, bad out, good in, good out. So,
Yeah, and I think that the most troubling thing about the rental market and distilling all of that information, we all can go look at what advertised rents are, but very few times do you actually get the real story of was there a concession? What did it actually lease for? How long did it lease? So having someone go through that data is really impactful for those that need the data. So you provide a really great service for the community. I do have a final question that I just wanted to ask you, Scott, just about just kind of where Denver's going. All of the statistics really seemed like 2012 was that kind of pivot point where everything just popped. And I know we have the COVID bubble and supply and demand and things changed, but what two-part question, what do you think really was going on? Maybe some of it's anecdotally in 2012 post Great Recession that caused Denver to be such an in-demand city, and then where do you think we're going in the future?
um, so I think that what happened, I think that we weathered the Great Recession better than other places in general. Yes, we had a recession in Denver just like everywhere else, but I think we weathered it better than a lot of other places. And part of that was because people were losing jobs and things were happening, and they're like, you know what? If I'm gonna have to start over again, I want to do it in Colorado because it's a great place to live. There's a quality of life, and so I think we had a huge that's when Denver kind of its name got put on the map as a place to go, as a place that people wanted to move to. It wasn't just a place to go on vacation and go skiing once a year. It became a place where, you wanted to move to, especially if you were moving from California or you were moving from New York or you were moving from one of these more expensive markets. And at that point, we weren't an expensive market. And so we had the benefit of A, credibility with the name, B, awesome quality of life, and C, affordable. And so over that time, we also had our local economic drivers, or like the people who were in charge of bringing in new companies and new jobs and new bodies did a very good job. Denver was open for business, right? Denver was a place that it was easy to do business, and we were trying to move headquarters in, we were trying to create new jobs in Denver, and the economic development that occurred during the 2010s, I think really impacted Denver, and Denver grew up. Denver became a new city, a different city, a bigger city in the 2010s. And then I think we got to a point where we were expensive, and now people are starting to maybe think about leaving because it's so expensive. And I think between that and the fact that somehow, some way, I think that we lost a little bit of that economic development uh, mindset. And I don't feel like Denver is as open for business as it once was. I think that there are, we're starting to over legislate things, and we're starting to put a lot of consumer protections in place. And I'm not anti-consumer protection, but at some point when you over legislate something, it becomes a market that people get nervous about. And so I think that's where we're at right now. Is we're not doing the economic development. We're losing those jobs, and those, companies aren't moving their headquarters to Denver anymore. They're moving their headquarters to Austin, and we're losing to Texas because they're doing a better job of economic development down there, and creating that. And so that's where I think we were and where we are now. I don't think that Colorado is Colorado. The quality of life here, the 300 days of sunshine, the access to the mountains, the access to, hiking, and all of that is never going to change. That is our identity and who we are and what we are. So I think that we will see, people return, especially as it's become a more affordable market with rents down 10% year over year. So I think that moving forward, and again, real estate always happens in cycles. We're at the bottom of a bad cycle, like a really pretty deep trough of a cycle. But we also had a really high peak of that cycle. I think that we'll normalize a little bit more, and maybe the cycles will be a little bit less severe. We'll still see ups and and downs, but we'll kind of normalize moving forward. And I think that we will stabilize again. We'll get back to rent growth. We'll get back to population growth. We'll get back to a place that we were. But I would like to see more of that economic development and more of that mindset of what can we do to not scare away the bodies and the employers and the people that we need to continue to grow.
Scott, as we pop out of your slideshow presentation, I just want to remind everybody that that'll be available on YouTube. If you need additional information, Scott gave you his contact information, but I just want to say, of course, I appreciate your time and energy. A favorite quote of mine that has become more recent is from a thought leader in the real estate space named Brian Buffini, and he shares that in our digital age, of all the things going on, social media, AI, the internet's obviously here to stay. We're a world that is drowning in information and starving for wisdom. And so to be able to distill statistics down and present it to an audience in such a way that makes sense is really something that I think is quite a talent. To have that finesse with numbers, and your team to have the passion that they do to create this on a quarterly basis and continue to stay up with it. I commend you, and I share a sincere thanks and gratitude for being with our audience today. So for you, Scott Rathbun, I'm just going to say to everybody, I appreciate the listen, the download, subscribe. As I love to say, Scott and I, we will see you around the neighborhood. Thanks for tuning
Sounds
in.
good.